3 centuries of vampire lore, broken in a single sentence. The council had already chosen his bride, a bloodline older than the monarchy, a fortune that could end 100 years of border wars in a single signature. Every noble house in the northern court expected the wedding to happen exactly as arranged. Cassius Thorne looked past all of it. He chose the servant girl instead. By the time the signing night finally arrived, one noble house would lose everything it owned. A king would go to war for a woman with no bloodline, no fortune, and no name that meant anything in his world. And a housemaid who could not remember the night her own family died would learn, months later, that the man she served had already saved her life once before, 16 years before she ever set foot in his house. None of it started the way anyone expected it to. Ravengate Manor did not appear on any map drawn after 1911. 7 miles of black pine forest guarded it from the rest of the world. Soot-dark stone. Half the house had no windows at all. The handful of locals who still remembered the old stories called it simply the house that eats its guests. They were not entirely wrong. It belonged to House Thorne, one of the last unbroken vampire bloodlines to survive the purges of the 17th century. And it belonged, more specifically, to the man who ruled it, Cassius Thorne, sovereign of the Northern Court for 211 years. A king who had buried his father, survived 3 wars fought entirely in the shadows of human history, and inherited a crown built on obligation instead of desire. By every account whispered through the drawing rooms of the immortal elite, he was the most eligible and the most miserable creature in the hemisphere. He had refused every bride his council presented to him for the better part of a century. He had no idea, yet, that the woman who would finally break that pattern was already 3 weeks from walking through his front gate, carrying nothing but a servant's contract and a memory she had spent 16 years trying not to look at too closely. Wren Ashby had never heard of House Thorne. She had never heard of vampires at all. Not really. Not as anything more than the kind of story parents used to keep children away from the tree line after dark. What she remembered of her own past came to her only in fragments, sharp enough to still cut. Wood smoke turning suddenly, violently metallic. Her mother's voice telling her to run and not look back. A sound she had never once been able to describe to anyone, of something moving through the trees faster than anything with a heartbeat should move. She had been 7 years old the night her village burned. A rogue coven tore through it in a single night, hunting a debt they claimed the town elders owed them. By morning, there was nothing left but ash and 31 graves, and one small girl found 3 miles into the forest, unmarked, unbitten, with no memory at all of how she had gotten there. 16 years later, she still didn't know who had carried her that far. She grew up after that in the house of a distant, exhausted aunt who fed her and clothed her and never once asked her to call it home. When the aunt died of consumption, Wren was 23, with no money, no family, and no trade beyond the herb lore. Her mother had taught her before the fire took everything else. The employment agency that eventually placed her did not ask many questions. Neither did she. She had learned a long time ago that questions were a luxury reserved for people who had somewhere else to go. She signed the contract without reading half of it. She did not ask why the salary offered for a housemaid position was 10 times the standard rate, or why it required her silence, her discretion, and her willingness to disappear somewhere the agency described only as private, secure, and remote. She arrived at Ravengate Manor on a grey October morning. in the back of a car with windows tinted too dark to see through. And she did not see daylight again for 3 full days. She had no idea. Yet, what kind of house she had just walked into? The head housekeeper, a sharp, watchful woman named Agnes Pryor, took one look at her small frame and calloused, capable hands, and assigned her, without much explanation, to the East Conservatory, a position that had stood empty, Agnes said, for a very long time. One that required, she added carefully, a particular kind of care. Wren did not understand yet that the plants in that conservatory were not decoration. She did not understand that her mother's half-remembered herb lore was the exact reason her file had been pulled from 400 others. She only understood that the room was warm and quiet, and that nobody there asked her to explain the scars in her memory. For the first 2 weeks, she saw no one from the family at all. She heard about them the way the rest of the staff did, in hushed corridor conversations that stopped the moment a door creaked. The dowager, Lady Miriam Thorne, who had not smiled, according to the older staff, since her husband was killed in the court wars nearly a century ago. And the king, Lord Cassius. Nobody in the servants' wing used his given name without lowering their voice first, as though the syllables themselves carried weight. "He doesn't bite the staff," one of the younger maids told Wren, over a rushed midnight meal, half joking, half not. "He barely looks at us at all, keeps to the west wing, keeps to himself. Some nights you hear him in the old ballroom, pacing till dawn. Agnes says, it's been like that since before any of us started here, since before his father died, even." "Why does he pace?" Wren had asked. The younger maid had shrugged, already losing interest, already moving on to gossip about the wine cellar. "Because kings don't get to choose anything, I suppose. Not even their own wives." Wren had not thought much of the comment at the time. She had gone back to her plants, to the slow, meditative work of drying lavender and crushing wolfsbane into paste, grateful simply for a room with heat and a bed that was hers alone. It was not until the 3rd week, on a night she was never meant to be in the West Wing at all, that she understood exactly what the younger maid had meant. She had been sent, at nearly 2 in the morning, to deliver a tincture to the old library, a blend for headaches that the dowager's personal physician, a retired human doctor who had signed the same silence Wren had specifically requested be left on the reading table before dawn. Agnes had given her explicit instructions: do not linger. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not, under any circumstance, look anyone in the eye. Wren had followed every instruction until she reached the library door, which stood ajar, spilling a thin blade of candlelight into the corridor. She should have simply left the tincture on the nearest surface and retreated. Instead, some old, uncrushable part of her curiosity made her glance inside, and what she saw stopped her cold. A man sat alone at the enormous reading table, surrounded by towers of ledgers and unopened correspondence, his head bowed into one hand, utterly motionless, the picture of a man carrying something too heavy to set down even for a moment. He did not look up. He did not seem to have heard her at all, though she had made no sound. The candlelight caught the sharp architecture of his face, the dark hair falling loose across his forehead, and for one unguarded second, before he became aware of her and the mask of a sovereign slammed back into place, Wren saw something she recognized immediately, because she had worn it herself for 16 years. Exhaustion. Not the tiredness of a long day. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a weight so long they have forgotten what their own shoulders feel like without it. "You're not supposed to be here." His voice, when it finally came, was low and even, entirely without threat, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he had shouted. "I'm sorry, my lord." Wren dropped into the low curtsy Agnes had drilled into her, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor exactly as instructed. "I was told to leave this for the Dowager's physician. I'll go." "Wait." She froze. In the corner of her vision, she saw him rise from the table, unfolding to a height that made the room feel suddenly smaller, though he did not come any closer. When he spoke again, there was a strange, careful curiosity in his tone, as though he were examining something he had not expected to find in his own house. "You didn't flinch." Wren risked the smallest glance upward. "My lord?" "Most of the staff flinch," Cassius said, "when they see me unguarded, before they remember to be afraid. You didn't. You looked too concerned. For a moment, before you remembered your training." He tilted his head slightly, and in the candlelight, his eyes, which she would later learn shifted between a deep gray and something closer to storm-cloud violet, depending on his mood, studied her with an intensity that made her pulse climb into her throat. "That is either very brave or very foolish. Which is it?" "I don't know, my lord," Wren admitted, because lying to him had not even occurred to her as an option. "I think I was just tired enough not to remember to be afraid." Something in his expression shifted then. Some crack in 200 years of careful distance. And for a fraction of a second, Wren could have sworn she saw the corner of his mouth twitch toward something that was almost, nearly, a smile. "What is your name?" "Wren, my lord." "Wren Ashby." "Wren." He said it the way a man tests the weight of an unfamiliar coin. "You work the conservatory." It was not a question, which unsettled her more than if it had been. "Yes, my lord. You made the chamomile blend that was left for my mother last week, the one with the honeysuckle undertone." "I did, my lord. I thought it might sit easier than the standard preparation." "I hope that wasn't an overstep." It was not. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Wren began to wonder if she had been dismissed without being told. It was the first night in 3 weeks. She slept past midnight. Wren did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And to her surprise, the silence between them did not feel unbearable the way silence around powerful people usually did. It felt strangely, almost companionable. It was Cassius who finally broke it, stepping back toward the table and gesturing, with something that might have been reluctance, toward the door. "Leave the tincture. Go to bed, Wren Ashby. It's late, and Agnes will have my head if she finds one of her staff wandering the west wing after hours." "Yes, my lord." She set the small glass bottle on the edge of the table, careful not to disturb the papers, and turned to go. She was almost at the door when his voice stopped her one final time. "Wren." She turned back. "Thank you," he said, and there was something raw and unpracticed in the way he said it, as though gratitude were a language he rarely had occasion to speak. "For the tincture, for not flinching. It has been a very long time since anyone in this house has forgotten to be afraid of me." Wren did not fully understand, that night. Why those words followed her back to her narrow servant's bed and kept her awake long after the candles in the west wing had guttered out. She did not understand it for weeks, but she would understand it, eventually, with a clarity that would nearly break her heart in two, because Cassius Thorne was not a man accustomed to being seen. He was a king accustomed to being managed, negotiated with, feared, and used. And in one exhausted, unguarded moment in an empty library, a servant girl with no bloodline, no fortune, and no idea what she had just stumbled into had seen him anyway. Neither of them yet knew that House Kestrel's carriage was already 3 days from the gate. The summons came on a Tuesday, delivered not by Agnes but by the dowager's own personal attendant, a stiff, silver-haired vampire named Marcus, who had served the Thorne family since before Cassius was born. He found Cassius in the training hall beneath the east wing, where the king often spent the small hours of morning working through forms with a broadsword that had belonged to his grandfather, a habit the staff had long since learned not to interrupt. Marcus interrupted it anyway. "Your mother requests your presence in the council chamber." Immediately. Cassius did not lower the blade right away. "The council doesn't convene on Tuesdays." "It does today." Marcus's expression, carefully neutral for 400 years of practice, betrayed the faintest flicker of something that might have been sympathy. "Lord Kestrel has sent word ahead of his arrival. My lord, the full delegation is confirmed for the end of the month." Cassius set the sword down with far more force than necessary, the ring of steel against the stone floor echoing through the empty hall. He had known this conversation was coming. He had known it, in truth, for the better part of a decade. Ever since his mother first began raising the subject at increasingly frequent intervals, each time with a little less patience for his deflections. He had simply allowed himself to believe, foolishly, that he had more time. The council chamber of Ravengate Manor was a circular room beneath the manor's original tower, its walls lined with the portraits of every Thorne sovereign back to the founding of the Northern Court. In 1603, Lady Miriam Thorne sat at the head of the long obsidian table when Cassius entered, flanked on either side by the 7 elders who comprised the ruling council, ancient creatures, most of them older than the manor itself, whose collective word carried nearly as much weight in matters of succession as the king's own. His mother did not rise when he entered. She rarely did anymore, not since the grief of his father's death had settled into something colder and more permanent than sorrow. Something that Cassius sometimes feared had hardened into pure political calculation. She gestured to the empty chair at the table's opposite end. "Sit, Cassius. We have matters to discuss." "I'm aware," Cassius said, remaining standing. "Marcus informed me. Kestrel's delegation." "Lord Malcolm Kestrel," Miriam corrected, with the faint, weary precision of a woman repeating herself for the 100th time, "has agreed, after 8 years of extremely delicate negotiation, to formally present his daughter Isabeau as a candidate for the Thorne succession. This is not a minor courtesy, Cassius. House Kestrel controls the entire southern trade routes. Their blood banks supply half the noble houses on this continent. An alliance between our two lines would end a century of border disputes and secure the Northern Court's position for the next 1,000 years. I am aware of the political calculus, Mother. I have been aware of it since I was old enough to understand what a marriage contract was. Then you understand why this cannot be delayed any further." One of the elders, a gaunt, ancient creature, named Balthazar, who had served 3 Thorn sovereigns before Cassius, leaned forward with the particular impatience of a man who had watched empires rise and fall and had very little tolerance left for the indecision of the young. "You are 211 years old, my lord, and you have refused every candidate presented to this council for the last 90 of them. The bloodline grows thin, the court grows restless. There are whispers, even now, of rival claims to the succession should you die without an heir." "Let them whisper." Cassius's voice was quiet, but it carried the particular stillness that made even the eldest members of the council fall silent when he used it. "I will not be rushed into a contract because a council of men who have not felt a genuine emotion in 3 centuries have grown impatient with my grief." "Your grief," Miriam said, and for the first time genuine pain flickered across her composed features, "was your father's, Cassius, not yours. You did not lose a wife. You lost a parent, as I did. And I did not have the luxury of 90 years to mourn him before I was required to hold this house together." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel physical. Cassius looked at his mother for a long moment, seeing, not for the first time, the exhaustion beneath her composure, the same exhaustion he recognized in his own reflection. Every night he failed to sleep. "I am not refusing out of grief," he said, finally, more quietly. "I am refusing because I have sat across from 30 women in the last 90 years, every one of them beautiful, every one of them from a bloodline old enough to satisfy this council, and I have not felt a single genuine thing from any of them except ambition. I can hear it, mother, every one of them. The calculations running behind their eyes even as they smile at me. I will not spend the next 1,000 years chained to a woman who sees me as a crown and not a person." "Then perhaps," Balthazar said, with the particular cruelty of a man who believed himself to be speaking a hard truth for the good of the realm, "you should adjust your expectations of what marriage among our kind is meant to provide. Love is a human indulgence, my lord. It was not love that built this house. It was strategy and duty, and the willingness to set aside personal desire for the survival of the bloodline." Cassius did not answer him. He looked instead at his mother, and something passed between them that the council could not entirely read, an old, private understanding between a son and a mother who had both, in their own ways, been asked to sacrifice more of themselves than anyone should reasonably have to give. "The delegation arrives in 3 weeks, Miriam said finally, her voice softening only slightly. "You will receive Lord Kestrel and his daughter with every courtesy this house is capable of extending. You will spend time with Isabeau. You will give this a genuine attempt, Cassius, not out of duty to this council, but because I am asking you, as your mother, to at least try before you close a door that cannot be reopened. Can you do that much for me?" Cassius closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, something in his posture had shifted. The fight gone out of it, replaced by the particular exhausted resignation of a man who had run out of arguments and had, perhaps, never truly believed he would win this one to begin with. 3 weeks, he said. I'll receive them. He left the council chamber without another word. And none of the 7 elders who watched him go, and none of his mother either, noticed the way his path through the manor afterward wound, without any conscious decision on his part, toward the East Conservatory, where a servant girl with no bloodline and no fortune was quietly repotting wolfsbane, entirely unaware that her world was about to collide catastrophically with his. He did not go in. He stood in the corridor outside the glass doors for nearly 10 minutes, watching her work through the frosted panes, watching the careful, unhurried way she handled the roots, humming something tuneless under her breath that she clearly did not realize anyone could hear. There was no calculation in the set of her shoulders, no performance in the small, private smile she wore while she worked. She simply existed, entirely herself, in a house full of people who had spent centuries learning to be anything but. Cassius did not know, standing in that corridor, that he was already lost. He would not know it, not fully, for several more weeks, but some old, ancient instinct in him, the same instinct that had once let him sense danger 3 miles distant through solid stone, recognized something in that conservatory that his conscious mind was not yet ready to name. He turned, finally, and walked away without going in, telling himself it was discipline. It was, in truth, the last, uncomplicated moment either of them would have for a very long time. The weeks that followed fell into an uneasy, unspoken rhythm neither Cassius nor Wren fully acknowledged, even to themselves. He began finding reasons to pass through the conservatory. A question about a tincture, a request for a specific blend his mother favored. Once, transparently, an inquiry about a plant he had clearly already known the name of, simply to have an excuse to stand in the doorway and watch her work for a few unhurried minutes before duty called him away again. Wren, for her part, stopped flinching at the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, learned the particular cadence of his silence, which she came to understand carried as much meaning as his words. She learned that he took his tea unsweetened, that he read the same worn copy of a 17th-century philosophy text so often the spine had cracked in 4 places, that he was, beneath the crushing weight of his title, achingly, painfully lonely, in a way that had nothing to do with being alone. She did not know, not yet, what he was, not entirely. The staff spoke in careful euphemisms around the family: long hours, sensitivity to sunlight, an old family condition, and Wren, raised to survive by minding her own affairs, had not pressed for details she suspected she was not meant to have. It was Agnes, in the end, who finally told her the truth. On a night 3 weeks before the Kestrel delegation was due to arrive, when she found Wren still awake past midnight, restocking the conservatory shelves with the particular restless energy of a woman who did not want to examine why sleep had become difficult. "You should know what you're working for, girl," Agnes said without preamble, settling into the old wicker chair by the conservatory door with the weary directness of a woman who had decided the time for careful evasion had passed. "Before you get in any deeper than you already are." Wren set down the jar in her hands carefully. "Agnes, they're vampires, Wren. All of them. The Dowager, the Elders, the King." Agnes said it plainly, without drama, the way one might state that it was raining outside. Every noble house in this part of the world is the same. Old bloodlines, older money, and a hunger they've spent centuries learning to hide behind good manners. You've been serving one of the oldest, most powerful sovereigns left standing in Europe, and you didn't even know it. Wren's first instinct, absurdly, was not fear. It was a kind of quiet, retrospective understanding. Pieces of the last 3 weeks sliding into place with an almost audible click. The way Cassius never took meals with the staff. The particular pale, unblemished quality of his skin that never seemed to change regardless of the season. The stillness of him, sometimes, that had unsettled her without her being able to name why. "He's never hurt anyone," she said finally. quietly. "Not that I've seen." "No," Agnes agreed, something unreadable passing behind her tired eyes. "He hasn't. Not the staff. Not in all the years I've served this house. He's a hard man to know, and a harder one to serve. But I've buried worse masters than Cassius Thorne, girl. And I'll tell you plainly, he is not the danger in this house." She paused, and when she continued, her voice had dropped lower, more careful. "The danger is coming up the drive in 3 weeks, with a smile sharp enough to open your throat, and a father who has spent 8 years arranging a wedding this family cannot afford to refuse." Wren did not sleep at all that night. She lay awake in her narrow servant's bed, turning the word over and over. Vampire, 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 trying and failing to reconcile it with the man who had stood in the doorway of the conservatory that morning. Unnecessarily, transparently, asking about a plant she suspected he had known the name of for 2 centuries, just to watch her hands work the soil for a few extra minutes before duty called him elsewhere. She should have been afraid. Some distant, sensible part of her insisted that she should be afraid, that everything Agnes had told her should have sent her packing at first light. Contract or no contract, back to whatever meager, dangerous freedom awaited a woman with no family and no prospects in the human world. Instead, she found herself in the grey hour before dawn, thinking only of the particular quality of his silence, the raw, unpracticed gratitude in his voice, the night he had thanked her for not flinching, and wondering with a dread that had nothing to do with fangs or shadows, what it would feel like to watch him receive Isabeau Kestrel at the front gate in 3 weeks' time, and to know with absolute certainty that whatever strange, quiet thing had begun growing between them in the conservatory would be expected to simply, obediently disappear. House Kestrel arrived on the first frost of November, a full day ahead of schedule, in a convoy of 3 matte black vehicles that swept up the long gravel drive of Ravengate Manor precisely at dusk, as though the timing itself had been calculated for maximum theatre. It had. Lord Malcolm Kestrel emerged first, a broad, silver-templed vampire, whose easy, politician's smile did not extend to his flat, calculating eyes. He was followed by a retinue of 6 attendants, and finally, deliberately last, by his daughter. Isabeau Kestrel stepped out of the vehicle the way a queen steps onto a stage she has already decided belongs to her. She was, by any measure, breathtaking. Pale gold hair swept into an elaborate coil, eyes the color of winter ice, a gown of deep emerald silk that had clearly been chosen to make an entrance rather than for comfort in the November cold she could not feel. She surveyed the manor's imposing facade with the particular satisfaction of a woman inspecting property she already considered half hers. And when Cassius appeared at the top of the front steps to receive them, formally dressed, his expression a careful diplomatic mask that Wren, watching from a servant's window on the 2nd floor with several other maids, had never seen him wear before. Isabeau's smile widened into something predatory. "Lord Cassius." Her voice, when it carried up to the assembled staff, was smooth as poured silk, pitched perfectly for an audience. 3 weeks of anticipation, and you're even more striking than the portraits suggested. I do hope the rumors of your reluctance were simply court gossip. It would be such a waste for a man like you to remain unclaimed. Lady Isabeau. Cassius inclined his head with exact, practiced courtesy, and Wren, even from a distance, could read the careful neutrality he had wrapped around himself like armor. "Welcome to Ravengate. I trust your journey was uneventful." "Eventful enough," Isabeau said, sweeping past him into the great hall, without waiting to be formally invited, her attendants trailing in her wake like a procession. "I do hope the hospitality here lives up to the house's reputation. I've heard such fascinating things about your staff." She said it lightly, almost carelessly, but something in the particular way her gaze swept across the assembled household servants lined up in the entrance hall to receive the guests made the back of Wren's neck prickle with an instinct she did not yet have a name for. The next several days passed in a strange, suspended tension that permeated every level of the manor. Formal dinners stretched late into the night, the great hall glittering with the particular cold elegance of vampire nobility at its most performative. Lord Kestrel and Lady Miriam spent long hours closeted in the council chamber, hammering out the granular terms of an alliance that both families had clearly already decided, regardless of what Cassius himself might feel about it, was going to happen. And Isabeau, when she was not performing charm for Cassius's benefit in front of witnesses, spent her idle hours exploring the manor with the proprietary curiosity of a woman measuring rooms for new curtains. It was on the fourth night that she found the conservatory. Wren was alone, finishing the evening's watering rounds later than usual, when the glass doors swung open without warning, and Isabeau Kestrel stepped through them, still dressed in the deep burgundy gown she had worn to dinner, a crystal glass of dark wine dangling loosely from her fingers. "So this is where you hide," Isabeau said, and there was nothing warm in her voice at all now. None of the practiced charm she'd deployed downstairs. She circled the room slowly, trailing one manicured finger along the edge of the potting table, her ice-pale eyes cataloguing everything with the particular disdain of a woman who had never once had to grow her own food or mend her own clothes. "The conservatory girl. I've heard your name mentioned. Twice, in fact. Which is twice more than any servant in this house is generally worth mentioning." Wren set down her watering can carefully, deliberately, and dropped into the low curtsy Agnes had trained into her, keeping her eyes on the floor. "My lady, is there something I can prepare for you? Look at me when I speak to you." The command carried a small, cold thread of compulsion behind it. The particular pressure Wren was beginning to learn accompanied any vampire of significant age or power when they chose to exert their will. She lifted her eyes and found Isabeau studying her with the clinical, unhurried attention of a predator, deciding whether something was worth the effort of killing. "You served him tea in the library twice this week." Isabeau's voice was silk over steel. "You brought a tincture for his mother that he thanked you for personally in front of two of his mother's own attendants. You are, apparently, the first member of this household staff he has bothered to learn the name of in longer than anyone here can remember." She took a slow step closer, and Wren forced herself not to retreat, remembering, distantly, Agnes's warning about the particular danger of showing fear to something that fed on it. "I find myself curious, little servant, what exactly it is you imagine is happening between the two of you." "Nothing is happening, my lady." Wren kept her voice as level as she could manage. "I bring tea to the library because it is part of my duties. Nothing more." Isabeau's smile did not reach her eyes. "See that it stays that way." She set her wine glass down on the potting table with deliberate, unnecessary force. hard enough that the delicate crystal cracked audibly along its stem, dark liquid spreading in a slow stain across the wood. I have spent 8 years securing this alliance, girl. My father has spent a fortune, and I have spent something considerably more valuable, my patience, which is a resource I do not extend generously twice. I did not travel 300 miles and endure 3 weeks of tedious negotiation to be inconvenienced by a housemaid's misplaced fancy for a man who is, in every way that matters, already spoken for. She leaned in close enough that Wren could feel the unnatural cold radiating off her skin, could smell the sharp copper undertone beneath her expensive perfume. Cassius Thorne is going to be my husband. He is going to be king beside me, whether he currently understands that or not. And you, little bird, are going to remember your place before I'm forced to remind you of it in a manner considerably less pleasant than this conversation. She swept out of the conservatory without waiting for a response, leaving Wren standing alone among the shattered crystal and the slowly spreading wine stain, her heart hammering so hard against her ribs she could feel it in her throat. It was the first time since the fire that had taken her family that Wren Ashby had felt, with absolute clarity, that she was standing directly in the path of something that could destroy her without a second thought, and would not lose a moment's sleep over the decision afterward. She did not tell Agnes what had happened. She did not tell anyone. She simply cleaned up the broken glass, mopped the wine from the floorboards, and returned to her narrow room in the servants' wing, where she lay awake long past moonrise, turning Isabeau's words over in her mind, a housemaid's misplaced fancy, and trying, without much success, to convince herself the woman was wrong. She was not entirely certain, by then, that she wanted her to be. Cassius found her 3 days later in the walled garden behind the east wing, a small half-wild plot of land the manor's official gardeners had largely abandoned, where Wren had taken to spending the rare hour of free time she was afforded, tending a modest bed of medicinal herbs that had clearly not been touched by professional hands in years. He had, he told himself, come looking for a specific rootstock the conservatory's official records claimed did not exist anywhere on the property. It was, in truth, the 4th excuse he had invented that week to seek her out, and by now they both understood, without ever saying so aloud, that the excuses were beginning to wear thin. "You've been avoiding the library," he said, without preamble, settling onto the low stone wall a careful, respectful distance from where she knelt in the dirt. "I've been busy, my lord." Wren did not look up from the herbs she was tending. The Kestrel delegation requires a great deal of additional preparation. Extra linens, special provisions for Lady Isabeau's attendants. That isn't why. Wren's hands stilled. She sat back on her heels finally, brushing the dirt from her palms, and looked at him directly, something she had learned over these strange weeks. He seemed to prefer over the deference the rest of the staff instinctively deployed. "No," she admitted. "It isn't." Cassius was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder, on the bare, frost-touched branches of the garden's single ancient apple tree. "Isabeau spoke to you?" "In the conservatory." It was not a question, and Wren felt something cold settle in her stomach at the confirmation that he already knew. "How did you—" "She mentioned it to my mother," framed as a concern about staff discipline. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I gather the conversation was somewhat more pointed than concern about discipline generally requires." Wren said nothing, which was, in its own way, an answer. "I am sorry," Cassius said, and the raw sincerity in it startled her more than an apology from a king had any right to. You should not have been made to feel unsafe in your own place of work because of a political arrangement that has nothing to do with you. It's not my place to have feelings about it either way, my lord. Wren returned her attention to the herbs, needing somewhere else to look. You're going to marry her. That's simply the way of things. I understand that. Do you? His voice had dropped lower, and when Wren glanced up again, she found him watching her with an intensity that made the cold November air feel suddenly insufficient. Because I confess I do not understand it myself, Wren. Not really. No matter how many times my mother and her council explained the necessity of it to me. I have sat across a dinner table from Isabeau Kestrel for 4 nights running, and in 4 nights I have not once felt from her a single genuine thought that was not, in some fashion, a calculation of what my crown could provide her. And in 3 weeks in this house, I have felt more honest warmth from a servant tending wolfsbane in a glass conservatory than I have felt from any noble bride paraded before this council in the last 90 years. The words hung in the cold air between them, and Wren felt something in her chest crack open in a way she had spent 16 years carefully guarding against. You shouldn't say things like that to me, she whispered. I know. Cassius did not move, did not close the careful distance between them, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested it cost him considerable effort not to. I know precisely what I should and should not say, Wren. I have known it since the night in the library, if I am honest with myself, which I have spent a great deal of effort avoiding since. But I find that I am tired, genuinely, bone-deep tired, in a way that has nothing to do with 200 years of ruling this court, of only ever saying what I should. Wren did not trust herself to answer that. She sat in the frost-touched garden, the last of the season's herbs withering gently around her, and looked at the king of the northern court, who was watching her with an expression she had only ever seen once before, in the unguarded candlelight of the library, and understood with sudden, terrifying clarity that whatever this was between them, it had already grown far too large to be contained by the careful boundaries either of them had tried to build around it. Neither of them heard the soft, deliberate scuff of a heel against the garden's flagstone path, 20 feet behind the wall, where Isabeau Kestrel stood in the shadow of the manor's east wing, her wine-dark eyes narrowed into something considerably colder than jealousy. Already, with the particular ruthless efficiency of her bloodline, beginning to calculate exactly what she was going to do about it. Isabeau did not confront Wren again directly, not for several days, and in the strange, false calm that followed, Wren allowed herself to believe, foolishly, that the matter had passed. She should have known better. Women like Isabeau Kestrel did not forget insults. They simply waited for the moment when inflicting punishment would cost them nothing and gain them everything. That moment arrived on the evening of the formal welcome banquet, 11 days before the delegation's scheduled departure, when House Thorn opened its great hall to the wider northern court for the first time in over a decade to formally present Isabeau as the king's intended bride. It was, by every account, whispered through the servants' corridors in the days leading up to it, the largest gathering Ravengate Manor had hosted since Cassius's own coronation 2 centuries prior. Nobles from 6 allied houses were expected. The Council of Elders would attend in full ceremonial regalia, and every member of the household staff, from the kitchens to the conservatory, had been drafted into service for the evening, an all-hands affair that left no one, including Wren, any excuse to remain hidden in the quiet corners of the manor where she usually preferred to disappear. Agnes assigned her to the refreshment table nearest the grand staircase, a position of some visibility that Wren suspected, correctly, had been chosen deliberately by someone with influence over the seating arrangements, though she would not learn who until it was too late to matter. The great hall, transformed for the evening, was a sight Wren had never imagined she would witness in her lifetime. Crystal chandeliers blazed with hundreds of candles, casting the assembled nobility in a warm, flattering light that did nothing to soften the cold, calculating undercurrent running beneath every exchanged pleasantry. Silk and velvet in every shade of midnight moved through the room in slow, deliberate circles, punctuated by the low, musical murmur of conversation conducted in at least 4 languages, none of them raised above a discreet whisper. Wren had never in her life seen so much wealth gathered in a single space, and she understood, watching it, exactly how small and insignificant a servant girl from a village with no name was meant to feel within it. Cassius arrived precisely at the appointed hour, dressed in formal black that made him look, Wren thought despite herself, less like a man and more like something carved from shadow and given purpose. Isabeau walked at his side in a gown of ice-white silk that caught the candlelight like frost, her hand resting on his arm with the proprietary confidence of a woman who had already, in her own mind, claimed victory. The assembled court rose as one when they entered, a wave of bows and curtsies rippling through the hall, and Lady Miriam Thorne, standing at the head of the room beside Lord Malcolm Kestrel, watched her son present his intended bride to 200 years of accumulated political weight, with an expression that mixed relief with something that might, in a kinder light, have been mistaken for hope. Wren watched from behind the refreshment table, pouring wine for guests who did not so much as glance at her, and told herself, with grim determination, that this was exactly as it should be. This was the world Cassius belonged to. Silk and crystal and bloodlines stretching back centuries. Not a walled garden gone to seed. Not a conservatory smelling of crushed herbs. Not a servant girl with no family and no name worth mentioning in rooms like this one. She almost believed it, until Cassius's gaze found hers across the crowded hall. It happened only once, and only for a moment, a single unguarded glance thrown across 200 nobles and a fortune in candlelight. There, and gone so quickly that Wren might have convinced herself she had imagined it, except that Isabeau, standing at his side with her hand still possessively curled around his arm, saw it too. The reprisal came within the hour. Wren was crossing the edge of the hall with a fresh tray of wine when Isabeau appeared directly in her path, seemingly from nowhere, moving with the particular silent grace that Wren had come to recognize as a warning sign in itself. There was no time to retreat, no time even to fully register what was happening before Isabeau's hand shot out, not toward the tray but toward Wren's wrist, gripping it with bone-bruising force and twisting, sharply, deliberately, so that the entire tray of crystal glasses tipped and shattered across the polished marble floor in a crash loud enough to silence the nearest 30 conversations at once. "How clumsy," Isabeau said, her voice pitched to Carrie, dripping with performed concern. "Are you quite all right, girl? You seem to have lost your footing entirely." Wren, on her knees among the broken glass with dark wine soaking rapidly into the hem of her uniform, understood immediately what had happened. Understood that Isabeau had engineered the entire spectacle with surgical precision, timed to draw the attention of exactly the right onlookers. A ring of curious, faintly amused nobles had already begun to form, drawn by the crash and the promise of small cruelty as entertainment. "Forgive me, my lady," Wren said, keeping her voice level despite the throbbing pain in her wrist, where Isabeau's grip had left marks that would bruise by morning. "I'll clean this immediately. See that you do." Isabeau's ice-pale eyes glittered with satisfaction as she turned, with theatrical grace, to address the small crowd that had gathered. "I do apologize for the disruption. The staff here are clearly unaccustomed to events of this scale. One does hope House Thorn will consider additional training before the wedding, given the standards my own household maintains." A ripple of polite, cutting laughter moved through the onlookers, the particular cruel amusement of powerful people watching someone with no power at all be humiliated for their entertainment. Wren kept her eyes fixed on the glass shards scattered across the marble, her face burning with a shame that had nothing to do with the accident and everything to do with the deliberate audience Isabeau had assembled to witness it, and did not look up even when she heard the crowd part again, this time for footsteps that carried an authority no one in the room would have dared ignore. "What?" Cassius said, his voice quiet and precise, in the particular way Wren had already learned, meant genuine anger. "Is happening here?" The laughter died instantly. Isabeau's expression shifted, smooth and immediate, into something approaching concern. "A simple accident, my lord." The girl lost her footing. "I was only remarking that perhaps the staff could benefit from—" "I saw what happened, Isabeau." The temperature in that section of the hall seemed to drop several degrees at once. Isabeau's composure flickered, just briefly, before resettling into place. "My lord, I assure you, I watched you take her wrist." Cassius's voice had not risen, had not changed in volume at all, and somehow that made it more devastating than shouting could ever have been. "I watched you engineer this entire display for the benefit of an audience. I am 211 years old, Isabeau. I have sat through a great many performances in my lifetime, and I recognize one when it is staged directly in front of me." The assembled nobles, sensing the sudden and dangerous shift in the room's atmosphere, began to drift away with the particular practiced discretion of people who understood exactly when a conversation had become too dangerous to witness. Isabeau, left standing alone in the widening circle of retreating guests, seemed for the first time since her arrival to genuinely falter. "Cassius, this is beneath. Do not," he said, and something in his voice carried an edge of true danger now, "ever touch a member of my household staff again. Is that understood?" Wren, still kneeling among the broken glass, watched this unfold with a rising panic that had nothing to do with her own humiliation and everything to do with what was certain to follow. This was not simply a private rebuke delivered quietly, sparing everyone involved. This was the sovereign of the Northern Court publicly correcting his intended bride, in front of an audience of 200 watching nobles, over the treatment of a housemaid nobody in that room could name. It would not be forgotten. It would not be forgiven. And Wren understood, with sick certainty, precisely who would ultimately pay the price for it. Cassius knelt then, without any apparent concern for the formal black of his attire, and extended a hand to help Wren to her feet, an act so far outside the bounds of what any sovereign was expected to do for household staff, that a fresh ripple of murmurs moved through the retreating crowd. "You're bleeding," he said quietly, his fingers gentle around her uninjured hand as he helped her rise, his gaze catching on the darkening bruise already forming around her opposite wrist. Something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. There, and controlled, almost instantly. "Go to Agnes! Have this seen to, my lord. I don't want to cause—" "You have caused nothing," Cassius said, low enough that only she could hear. "You did nothing wrong tonight, Ren. Nothing at all." He released her hand, and the moment broke, and Ren fled the great hall with as much dignity as she could salvage, aware of Isabeau's gaze burning into her back the entire distance to the servants' corridor, aware, with a certainty that settled cold and permanent in her chest, that whatever fragile peace had existed at Ravengate Manor before that night had just been irrevocably shattered. Agnes found her 20 minutes later in the small first-floor washroom reserved for staff, sitting on the edge of the porcelain tub with her bruised wrist cradled against her chest, staring at nothing. "Let me see." Agnes's voice was gruff but not unkind, as she took Ren's arm and examined the darkening marks with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had tended a great many small injuries over her years of service. "Nothing broken. It'll bruise for a week. No more." She was quiet for a moment, working a cooling salve into the tender skin with careful, practiced fingers. "I heard what happened in the hall. Everyone heard, I imagine. Everyone heard." Agnes did not offer false comfort, which Ren had come, over these strange weeks, to appreciate about her. And everyone saw the king defend a housemaid in front of the assembled northern court, 3 weeks into his own betrothal ceremony to another woman entirely. She set the salve aside and looked at Ren directly, her expression unreadable. "Do you understand what you've become, girl? Whether you meant to or not?" "I haven't become anything," Ren said, though even to her own ears it sounded unconvincing. "I'm a servant, Agnes. I tend the plants. That's all I am here." Isabeau Kestrel does not believe that. Agnes's voice dropped lower, more urgent, and a woman like Isabeau Kestrel, backed by a father like Malcolm Kestrel, does not simply accept humiliation and walk away quietly, girl. I have served this house for 60 years. I have watched noble alliances fracture over smaller insults than the one delivered tonight. You need to understand the danger you are standing in, and you need to understand it before it is too late to matter. Ren looked down at the bruise blooming purple around her wrist, at the shape of Isabeau's fingers pressed into her skin, and felt, for the first time since she had arrived at Ravengate Manor, genuinely afraid. Not of Cassius, not of what he was, but of the woman he was expected to marry, and of exactly how far that woman might be willing to go to protect a fortune and a crown 8 years in the making. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered. Agnes did not have an answer for her. Neither of them, in that quiet washroom on the night of the welcome banquet, could have imagined how quickly the answer would arrive, or how much blood it would ultimately cost to find it. The days that followed the banquet settled into something colder and more watchful than the uneasy peace that had preceded it. Isabeau did not approach Ren directly again, but her presence seemed to permeate every corner of the manor Ren occupied, a cold, deliberate awareness that made the back of her neck prickle even in rooms where the woman was not physically present. Twice, Ren found the conservatory door standing open when she was certain she had locked it. Once, an entire tray of carefully cultivated seedlings, months of patient work, was found overturned and ruined on the greenhouse floor. No explanation offered, no one claiming responsibility. though Wren did not need a confession to understand precisely whose hand had done it. Cassius, for his part, grew visibly, increasingly strained under the mounting pressure of a council that had begun, in the aftermath of the banquet's public spectacle, to apply considerably more direct pressure toward finalizing the betrothal contract before further embarrassment could accumulate. Lady Miriam summoned him to the council chamber nearly every evening that week, and Wren, catching glimpses of him crossing the corridors between these sessions, watched the exhaustion she had first recognized in the library, that first unguarded night, deepen into something closer to genuine despair. She found him, 6 days after the banquet, standing alone at the edge of the walled garden in the gray hour before dawn, staring out at the frost-hardened earth with an expression so far removed from the composed sovereign. The court had witnessed publicly that Wren's breath caught in her chest at the sight of it. "You should be sleeping," she said quietly, approaching from the garden path with the same careful, unhurried steps she used with anything wounded. "I have found," Cassius said without turning, "that sleep has become somewhat elusive lately." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally turned to face her, the raw exhaustion in his expression struck her like a physical blow. "The council has moved the formal signing forward. What was meant to occur at the end of my mother's originally proposed timeline will now take place in 4 days' time, during the Kestrel delegation's final night at Ravengate before their scheduled departure." Wren felt something cold settle in her chest. 4 days. 4 days. He looked at her with an intensity that made the frost-touched garden feel suddenly very small around them. "After which, Wren, I will be formally, irrevocably bound to Isabeau Kestrel under the ancient contracts of this court. Contracts that predate the founding of most human nations and cannot, once sealed, be broken by anything short of death." His voice, when he continued, had dropped to something barely above a whisper, raw, in a way she had never heard from him before. "I have spent 211 years learning to accept the weight of this crown, Wren. I have buried a father I loved. I have fought wars I did not choose, and I have done all of it because I believed, somewhere beneath the exhaustion, that duty was worth the cost of my own happiness. I do not know anymore if I still believe that, Cassius." It was the first time she had ever used his given name without the title attached, and the sound of it seemed to land between them with a weight neither of them had anticipated. "You don't have to explain yourself to me. I want to." He crossed the small distance between them, close enough now that she could feel the particular, unnatural stillness that radiated from him, the absence of a heartbeat she had learned over these strange weeks no longer frightened her at all. "I have spent every night since the banquet trying to convince myself that what I feel when I am near you is simply exhaustion or loneliness or some passing fascination that will fade once the contract is signed and the matter is settled. I have failed entirely to convince myself of any of it." His hand rose, hesitated, and then, with a gentleness that made Wren's breath catch, brushed a loose strand of hair back from her face. "I do not know what to do with what I feel for you, Wren Ashby. I only know that in 211 years, no one has ever made me want to set down this crown as badly as I want to set it down right now, standing here with you." The frost-touched garden around them seemed to hold its breath. Wren looked up at him, at the ancient, exhausted king, who had somehow, impossibly, become the first person since the fire that took her family to make her feel entirely, unguardedly seen, and understood that whatever happened in the 4 days that remained before the signing, she would not be able to walk away from this unscathed, no matter how hard she tried. 4 days, she whispered. 4 days, Cassius agreed, and neither of them moved to close the remaining distance. Between them, both suspended in the particular agony of wanting something neither of them yet believed they were allowed to have. Neither of them saw the figure watching from the shadowed archway at the garden's edge, where Isabeau Kestrel stood utterly motionless. Her ice-pale eyes narrowed into something far more dangerous than jealousy now. Already, with the cold efficiency that had made House Kestrel one of the most feared trading powers in the immortal world, beginning to draft the letter that would, within hours, summon her father into the council chamber for a conversation that would change the course of everything that followed. Lord Malcolm Kestrel received his daughter in the small private study adjoining his guest chambers less than an hour later, still dressed in his nightclothes, his patience visibly thinning, as Isabeau paced the length of the room, recounting what she had witnessed in the garden. "You are certain," he said finally, "of what you saw?" "I am certain," Isabeau said, "that the sovereign of the Northern Court stood in a frozen garden at dawn, confessing his feelings to a servant girl 4 days before his formal betrothal to me is set to be sealed before the entire council." Her voice had lost every trace of the honeyed charm she deployed in public rooms, stripped down now to something considerably colder. 8 years, father. 8 years of negotiation. And he is prepared to throw it away over a housemaid who tends his mother's herb garden. Malcolm Kestrel was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the low candlelight. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of his daughter's heat, only a calm, methodical calculation that was, in its own way, considerably more dangerous. "Then we will simply have to ensure," he said, "that the girl does not survive to see the signing." Isabeau went very still. "You said it yourself, Isabeau. 8 years of negotiation. I did not come to this house to leave it without a crown for this family, and I will not allow a servant with no bloodline and no name to undo a decade of careful work." He rose from his chair, crossing to the window that overlooked the dark, frost-hardened grounds of Ravengate Manor, where somewhere beyond the reach of candlelight, a king and a housemaid stood in a garden neither of them yet understood was already being measured for a grave. 4 days, he said quietly. That is more than enough time. Wren did not know, in the 2 days that followed the garden, that she had already been marked for death. She knew only that something in the manor's atmosphere had shifted, a coldness that seemed to follow her through the corridors, even in rooms where no one else was present, and that Agnes, whose sharp instincts had kept her alive through 60 years of service to a house full of predators, had begun watching her with a wary, watchful concern that Wren did not fully understand until it was almost too late. "You're not to go anywhere alone," Agnes told her on the second morning, cornering her outside the conservatory with an urgency that startled Wren more than the words themselves. "Not to the garden, not to the cellars, not even to your own room without one of the other girls beside you. Do you understand me?" "Agnes, what's happened?" "Nothing yet." Agnes's weathered face was drawn tight with a fear Wren had never seen on her before. but I have served this house long enough to recognize the particular quiet that settles over a manor before something terrible happens in it, and that quiet has been sitting over Ravengate for 2 days now. Malcolm Kestrel did not travel 300 miles and spend 8 years negotiating a marriage contract to watch it collapse over a housemaid. Men like him do not lose gracefully, Wren. They simply remove the obstacle. Wren felt the blood drain from her face. You think he means to hurt me? I think, Agnes said carefully, that you should have left this house the moment the king looked at you the way he did in that garden, and I think it is far too late now for either of us to wish that you had. She pressed a small folded paper into Wren's hand, and when Wren opened it, she found a rough map of the manor's service corridors marked with a route she did not recognize. If anything happens, if you feel even for a moment that you are not safe, you take this path. It leads to the old chapel beneath the West Tower, consecrated ground that predates the manor itself. Whatever hunts in this house, it will not follow you onto blessed stone. Do you understand? Agnes, you're frightening me. Good, Agnes said grimly. You should be frightened. Frightened people survive. It's the ones who feel safe, who end up in early graves. Wren carried the folded map in her apron pocket for the next 2 days, a small, constant reminder of a danger she could not fully see but had begun, despite herself, to feel in the 2 quiet corridors after dark, in the way conversations seemed to still whenever she entered a room where members of the Kestrel retinue were present. In the particular, watchful way, Isabeau's ice-pale eyes tracked her now across the length of the great hall during the evening meals, no longer bothering to disguise the naked hostility behind them. She did not tell Cassius. She told herself, in the small hours when she lay awake turning the decision over, that it was because she did not want to burden him further, that he was already carrying the weight of a council pressing him toward a marriage he did not want, and a mother he could not bear to disappoint. The truth, which she admitted to herself only in the darkest hour before dawn, was simpler and more painful. She was afraid that if she told him, he would do something reckless in her defense, something that would shatter whatever fragile chance still remained of him escaping this marriage without plunging the entire northern court into open war. She would rather carry the fear alone than watch him destroy himself trying to protect her. It was a decision that very nearly cost her everything. The attack came on the 3rd night, 2 days before the scheduled signing, in the hour just past midnight, when the manor's household staff had largely retired, and the great house settled into the particular hush that preceded the deepest hours of vampire activity. Wren had been sent, against Agnes's explicit instructions, to retrieve a specific tincture from the cellar storerooms, a request relayed through one of the junior kitchen staff, purportedly on the Dowager's authority, though Wren would later learn that Lady Miriam had made no such request at all. She descended the narrow servants' stairwell into the cellars with a single lantern, the flickering light casting long, uneven shadows across the ancient stone walls, and did not notice, until it was almost too late, that the storeroom door at the base of the stairs stood already ajar, though she was certain it had been locked when she last passed it that afternoon. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence, not the ordinary hush of a sleeping manor, but a deeper, more absolute stillness, the particular quality of quiet that comes when every small night sound the settling of old timber, the distant murmur of wind against stone has been deliberately, unnaturally suppressed. Wren stopped at the base of the stairs, her lantern raised, every instinct honed by 16 years of quiet survival screaming at her that something in the darkness ahead was wrong. She turned to retreat back up the stairs and found the way blocked. Two figures stood in the narrow stairwell above her, dressed in the plain, dark clothing of hired hands, rather than the formal livery of the Kestrel retinue, their faces obscured by shadow. But their eyes, when the lantern light caught them, held the flat, hungry gleam Wren had come, over these strange weeks, to recognize as unmistakably vampiric. "Easier this way," one of them said, his voice carrying no particular malice, simply the flat professionalism of a man performing a job he had been well paid to complete quickly. "No screaming, girl. And it won't hurt for long." Wren did not scream. Some instinct older than conscious thought. The same instinct that had once, 16 years ago, carried a 7-year-old girl 3 miles through burning forest without a single memory of the journey, took hold of her entirely, and she turned and ran deeper into the cellars instead. Abandoning the lantern, plunging into darkness, she knew only from the folded map Agnes had pressed into her hand 2 days earlier. She heard them behind her almost immediately, moving with a speed no human pursuer could have matched, and understood with terrifying clarity that she had perhaps seconds, not minutes, before they closed the distance entirely. She did not have time to think, only to move, her feet finding the uneven stone floor by memory and instinct rather than sight, her hand tracing the rough cellar wall to keep herself oriented in the absolute dark. "The old chapel," Agnes had said, "beneath the west tower, consecrated ground older than the manor itself." Wren had never actually walked the route in daylight, had only studied the rough lines of Agnes's hand-drawn map by candlelight in the privacy of her room. And in the panic of the moment, in the crushing darkness of the cellar with 2 hungry predators closing in behind her, she was no longer entirely certain she remembered it correctly. She took a turn she hoped was right, felt the stone beneath her feet shift from smooth flagstone to something rougher, older, and stumbled forward into a narrow passage that smelled of centuries-old incense and cold, undisturbed air. A hand closed around her ankle just as she crossed the threshold, dragging her down hard against the stone floor, the impact driving the breath from her lungs in a single, agonized gasp. She twisted, kicking wildly, and felt her heel connect with something solid enough to draw a hiss of genuine pain from her attacker, buying her half a second, no more, to scramble forward on her hands and knees across a threshold worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The reaction was immediate and violent. The moment her body crossed fully onto the consecrated stone of the old chapel floor, the hand gripping her ankle recoiled as though it had touched open flame. And behind her, in the darkness of the passage, she heard a shriek of genuine agony, followed by the frantic scramble of retreating footsteps. Wren lay on the cold chapel floor, gasping, her whole body shaking, for nearly a full minute before she trusted herself to move. When she finally pushed herself upright, bracing against an ancient stone pillar, she understood, with a clarity that made her stomach drop, that the 2 men who had chased her through the cellars had not simply given up. They were, even now, likely reporting their failure back to whoever had ordered the attack in the first place, and she had no way of knowing whether they would try again before dawn. She did not move from the chapel floor until the grey light of early morning began filtering weakly through a small, ancient, stained glass window set high in the western wall, at which point she finally, cautiously, made her way back through the cellars, every shadow along the route, sending her heart hammering into her throat, until she reached the servants' stairwell and climbed, on legs that would barely hold her weight, back up into the manor proper. Agnes found her 20 minutes later, sitting in stunned, silent shock on the edge of her narrow bed, still wearing the torn, dust-streaked uniform from the night before, and understood immediately, without needing to ask, exactly what had happened. Thank God, Agnes breathed, crossing the room in 3 quick strides to grip Wren's shoulders, checking her over with the same rapid, practiced efficiency she had once used to assess the bruise on Wren's wrist. Thank God you remembered the chapel. They tried to kill me, Agnes. Wren's voice came out smaller and more broken than she intended. They chased me through the cellars. If I hadn't found the door, I know. Agnes's expression had gone hard, furious in a way Wren had never witnessed from her before. I know, girl, and I am so sorry. I did not see this coming sooner. I should have insisted you stay in your room after dark. I should have. She stopped herself, visibly forcing down the guilt, threatening to overwhelm her, and straightened with sudden, decisive purpose. This ends now. The king needs to know exactly what happened in that cellar last night, and he needs to know it before the signing ceremony tomorrow evening. Agnes, if I tell him, he will do exactly what any decent man would do upon learning that his own household staff attempted to murder an innocent woman under his roof, Agnes said firmly. Wren, listen to me. Whatever you fear will happen if he learns the truth. I promise you it is nothing compared to what will happen if you say nothing and they succeed on their second attempt. Because there will be a second attempt, girl. Men like Malcolm Kestrel do not simply accept failure and walk away. You are out of time to protect him from this. Now, you need to let him protect you. Wren found Cassius less than an hour later in the council chamber beneath the manor's original tower, deep in what appeared to be a tense, final negotiation session with his mother and Lord Kestrel regarding the precise terms of the following evening's signing ceremony. She should not have interrupted a formal council session, should have waited, according to every rule of household conduct Agnes had drilled into her since her first day at Ravengate. She did not care. She pushed through the heavy chamber doors without waiting to be announced. And the moment Cassius's eyes found her across the room, the moment he saw the torn, dust-streaked state of her uniform and the raw, unmistakable fear still written across her face, every trace of diplomatic composure he had been maintaining for Lord Kestrel's benefit shattered entirely. Wren. He was across the room before anyone else in the chamber had fully registered his movement, his hands gentle but urgent as he gripped her shoulders, his gaze sweeping over her with a desperate, searching intensity. What happened? Tell me exactly what happened. 2 men, Wren said, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, and the full weight of what had happened in the cellars was finally catching up with her. In the cellars last night, past midnight, they were waiting for me. They said, her voice broke, they said it wouldn't hurt for long. The temperature in the council chamber dropped so sharply that Lord Kestrel's own attendants took an involuntary step backward. Cassius went utterly, dangerously still, and when he turned to face the room, the violet grey of his eyes had bled into something considerably darker, a black so absolute it seemed to swallow the chamber's candlelight entirely. Explain, he said, and the single word carried enough raw menace that even the eldest members of the council, creatures who had survived centuries of political maneuvering, visibly flinched. Lady Miriam rose from her seat, her expression a careful mask of concern that did not entirely disguise the sharp, calculating alarm behind it. Cassius, We don't yet know. I know that a member of my household staff was hunted through my own cellars by hired hands last night, Mother. And I know that the timing of this attack, 2 days before a signing ceremony that a servant girl publicly humiliated my intended bride in front of 200 witnesses, does not strike me as coincidental. He turned his black, ancient gaze on Lord Malcolm Kestrel, who had gone very still in his chair, his easy politician's smile finally, entirely absent. Would you care to explain the timing, Malcolm? Or shall I ask my mother's household guard to review the manor's entry records from 3 nights ago, when your delegation's retinue arrived, carrying considerably more staff than your official guest list accounted for? I have no idea what you're implying, my lord. Kestrel's voice remained level, but Wren, watching from Cassius's protective grip, saw the faint sheen of genuine fear beginning to form at his temples. My household would never. Do not lie to me in my own council chamber. Cassius's voice had not risen at all, and somehow that made it infinitely more terrifying than shouting could have been. The candles lining the chamber walls guttered violently, as though a sudden wind had swept through the sealed room, and every vampire present, elder and attendant alike, felt the crushing weight of 211 years of accumulated sovereign authority bear down on the space, all at once. I can hear your heartbeat accelerating, Malcolm. I can hear the particular rhythm of a man calculating precisely how much of the truth he can afford to admit to before the lie becomes indefensible. I suggest you save us both the tedium and simply tell me what you have done. The council chamber held its breath. Isabeau, who had entered midway through the confrontation and stood now near the chamber's rear entrance, watched her father with an expression that had drained entirely of its usual cool confidence, replaced by something closer to genuine dread. It was for the good of this alliance, Kestrel said, finally, his voice thin and defensive now, all pretense of diplomatic ease abandoned. You were prepared to throw away 8 years of careful negotiation over an infatuation with a common housemaid, Cassius. I did what was necessary to protect the interests of both our houses. If the girl had simply... He did not finish the sentence. Cassius crossed the chamber in a blur too fast for any human eye to track, and the sound that followed, a single, sharp crack of impact, sent Lord Malcolm Kestrel flying backward across the length of the council table, scattering ledgers and correspondence in every direction before he crashed into the far wall hard enough to crack the ancient stonework. You ordered my household staff assaulted. Cassius's voice, when he spoke again, had dropped to something barely human, resonant with a fury that made the very walls of the chamber seem to tremble. In my own house, under my own roof, you sent hired hands to murder an innocent woman 2 days before you intended to sit at my table and sign a marriage contract binding our houses for 1,000 years. Kestrel pushed himself up from the wreckage of the council table, blood dark and thick, unmistakably his own running freely from a gash along his temple. His composure entirely stripped away now, replaced by naked, desperate fear. Cassius, be reasonable. She is nothing. A servant with no bloodline, no name worth speaking of in these halls. Kill her yourself, if her presence troubles you so greatly. But do not let a passing fascination with a common human destroy an alliance that will secure this court's stability for the next millennium. Something in the chamber changed the moment Kestrel finished speaking. A shift so absolute that even the ancient elders present, creatures who had witnessed centuries of political violence with clinical detachment, drew back instinctively. Cassius turned, slowly, deliberately, to look at Wren, still standing near the chamber doors where Agnes had guided her, and something in his expression, some final, irrevocable decision crystallizing behind his black, ancient eyes, told Wren with absolute certainty that whatever fragile hope had existed for a peaceful resolution to this evening had just been permanently, catastrophically extinguished. "The signing is cancelled," Cassius said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the silent chamber. "Effective immediately. There will be no alliance between House Thorn and House Kestrel. Not now, not ever, and Lord Malcolm Kestrel will consider himself fortunate to leave Ravengate Manor alive after what he has just confessed to in front of this entire council. You cannot simply—" Kestrel began, but Cassius was already moving, closing the distance between them with a speed that left Wren's breath caught in her throat. One hand closing around Kestrel's throat and lifting him bodily off the chamber floor with an ease that made a mockery of the older vampire's considerable age and strength. "I can," Cassius said, "and I will. You sent men to murder someone under my protection, in my own house, and you will answer for it exactly as ancient law demands." He turned his black gaze toward the assembled council, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "By the founding charter of this court, any noble house that orders violence against a member of a sovereign's household, without formal declaration of grievance, forfeits all claim to alliance, treaty, or protection under Northern Court law. I invoke that charter now, before this full council, as witness." Balthazar, the eldest of the council elders, rose slowly from his seat, his ancient, weathered face grave. "The charter has not been formally invoked in over 3 centuries, my lord. You understand what invoking it now will mean. House Kestrel's southern trade routes, their blood banks, the entire economic foundation this alliance was meant to secure." "I understand precisely what it means," Cassius said, still holding Kestrel suspended by the throat, the older vampire's face beginning to darken from lack of the air. His body did not strictly require, but still, in extremity, craved. "It means this court's stability will not be purchased with the blood of an innocent woman. It means that whatever price this house must pay for my refusal to marry a woman whose father orders assassinations over dinner conversation, we will pay it. Because the alternative is a court built on a foundation of exactly the violence and cruelty this family has spent 200 years trying to move beyond." He released Kestrel, letting the older vampire crumple to the chamber floor, gasping, and turned finally to address Isabeau, who stood, frozen near the rear entrance, her ice-pale composure entirely shattered. "Take your father," Cassius said, "and leave my house before dawn. If either of you, or anyone connected to House Kestrel, comes within 100 miles of Ravengate Manor again, or of Wren Ashby, wherever she may be, I will not extend the mercy I am extending tonight. Is that understood?" Isabeau did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the icy confidence Wren had come to associate with her, only a raw, wounded fury that seemed, for the first time, genuinely human beneath the vampiric cold. "You are choosing a housemaid over the future of this entire court, Cassius. Do you understand what you are destroying tonight? Everything my father and your mother spent 8 years building, I am choosing," Cassius said quietly, "not to build a future on a foundation of violence against people who never asked to be part of this court's politics in the first place. If that means the alliance dies tonight, then it was never worth building at all." Lady Miriam Thorne, who had remained silent through the entire confrontation, watching her son with an unreadable expression that mixed grief with something else. Something that might, in time, become a kind of reluctant respect, finally rose from her seat and crossed the chamber to stand beside him. "Get them out of my house," she said to the assembled guard who had gathered at the chamber's entrance, drawn by the commotion. "Before my son's mercy runs out entirely." Wren was not present for what followed in the hours immediately after the council chamber emptied. Agnes had pulled her away the moment the guards moved to escort Kestrel and his retinue from the premises, insisting, with an urgency that brooked no argument, that Wren needed rest and tending more than she needed to witness whatever came next. She spent the remainder of that night in a small guest chamber near the servants' wing, unable to sleep despite Agnes's careful ministrations, replaying the confrontation in the council chamber over and over. The memory of Cassius's black, ancient eyes and the terrible authority in his voice, both thrilling and frightening her in equal measure. She did not yet understand the full cost of what he had done. She would not understand it until the following morning, when Agnes brought her breakfast alongside news that had already begun spreading through the manor's servant corridors with the particular speed such things always traveled. "The southern trade routes closed overnight," Agnes said, setting the tray down with hands that were not entirely steady. "House Kestrel controls nearly half the blood supply for every noble house south of the border, girl. When Malcolm Kestrel's people withdrew from Ravengate this morning, they didn't simply leave quietly. They sent word ahead to every allied house along the trade network. As of this morning, House Thorn has been formally cut off from Kestrel's southern supply lines." Wren felt the full weight of what that meant settle over her slowly, sickeningly. "This is my fault. This is Malcolm Kestrel's fault," Agnes corrected firmly, "for ordering murder against an innocent woman rather than accepting that his daughter's marriage prospects had simply fallen through. Do not make the mistake of carrying guilt that does not belong to you, Wren." The king made his choice with clear eyes, understanding exactly what it would cost. And I do not believe for a single moment that he regrets it. But the trade route closure was, as it turned out, only the first and least dangerous consequence of the confrontation in the council chamber. By mid-afternoon, word had reached Ravengate through the Dowager's own intelligence network that Malcolm Kestrel, humiliated in front of the assembled council and stripped of the alliance he had spent 8 years constructing, had not simply retreated south to lick his wounds. He had instead traveled directly to the estate of Lord Aldrich Ravensworth, the single most powerful vampire lord in the Southern Territories, and, more critically, a long-time rival of House Thorn dating back to a border dispute that predated Cassius's own reign. Wren learned the full scope of what this meant that evening. When Cassius found her in the conservatory, where she had retreated in the aftermath of the day's chaos to lose herself in the familiar, grounding work of tending her plants, he looked, when he entered, more exhausted than she had ever seen him. The weight of the day's confrontation and its rapidly escalating consequences etched deep into every line of his face. "Kestrel has gone to Ravensworth," he said without preamble, settling heavily onto the low bench near the conservatory's central fountain. "They have old grievances between them, going back nearly a century. But they have never before had sufficient shared cause to act on them together. Kestrel is offering Ravensworth exactly what he needs to change that." Wren set down the shears she had been using and crossed to sit beside him. "What is he offering?" "Justification." Cassius's jaw tightened. "By ancient court law, a formal grievance against a sovereign's household requires evidence of genuine wrongdoing before other houses are permitted to intervene militarily. Kestrel cannot claim I wronged him. He ordered the assassination attempt. The entire council witnessed his confession, but he can claim, and is already claiming, that I invoked the founding charter improperly, that I manufactured a pretext to escape a marriage I had already privately decided to abandon, using an alleged assassination attempt that he insists was fabricated to provide legal cover. He looked at her, something raw and afraid beneath the exhaustion in his expression. If Ravensworth believes him, or simply decides the political opportunity is too valuable to pass up regardless of the truth, he has more than sufficient military strength to move against Ravengate directly. You mean war? Wren said quietly. I mean, Cassius said, that I may have just plunged this entire court into the first open conflict it has seen in over 80 years, and I did it to protect a woman that half of that court will insist was never worth the cost. He reached out, his fingers finding hers with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the grim weight of his words. I want you to know, Wren, whatever happens in the days ahead, that I do not regret the choice I made in that council chamber. Not for a single moment. But I need you to understand, the danger has not passed. If anything, it has only just begun. Wren looked down at their joined hands, at the particular way his cold fingers curled protectively around hers, and felt something settle inside her that she recognized, with a kind of quiet astonishment, as resolve rather than fear. Then we face it together, she said. Whatever it is. Cassius looked at her for a long moment, something in his expression shifting into an intensity that made her breath catch, before he leaned forward and, finally, after weeks of careful restraint and unspoken longing, closed the distance between them entirely. The kiss was slow and deliberate, cold lips against warm ones, and Wren felt the particular ancient stillness of him settle around her like a shelter rather than a threat. Felt, for the first time since the fire that had taken everything from her 16 years ago, something that might, with enough time and enough courage, grow into a home. They did not have long to enjoy the fragile peace of that moment. 3 days later, Lord Aldrich Ravensworth's forces arrived at the edge of Ravengate's outer boundary, under cover of a moonless night, and the fragile calm that had briefly settled over the manor shattered entirely. The attack came without warning or formal declaration, a deliberate breach of the ancient protocols that ordinarily governed conflict between the noble houses, and Wren would later understand that this, too, had been calculated. Ravensworth striking before Cassius had sufficient time to muster the Northern Court's own allied forces, or formally contest Kestrel's claims before the wider council. She woke to the sound of the manor's ancient perimeter wards shattering, a deep, resonant tremor that ran through the very foundations of Ravengate like the toll of some enormous bell, followed almost immediately by the distant, unmistakable sounds of violence breaking out along the manor's outer grounds. Agnes was at her door within seconds, already dressed, her expression grim with the particular calm of a woman who had lived through violence before and understood exactly what needed to happen next. Up now. We need to get you to the chapel. What's happening? Ravensworth's forces have breached the outer boundary. Agnes was already pulling Wren from the bed, pressing a heavy cloak into her hands. The king is mustering what defense he can, but Ravensworth did not come with a small retinue, girl. This is a full military incursion, and I do not intend to let you be caught in the middle of it. They made it as far as the second-floor corridor before the first of Ravensworth's forces breached the manor's interior defenses. Wren would remember the following minutes only in fragmented, terrifying pieces for the rest of her life. The shattering of glass somewhere below them, the guttural shouts of the household guard engaging invaders in the entrance hall, Agnes's hand gripping her wrist with bruising force as they fled deeper into the manor's interior, away from the chaos and toward the relative safety of the old chapel beneath the west tower. They did not make it. A figure dropped from the corridor's shadowed ceiling directly into their path, moving with a speed that gave Wren no time at all to react, and she felt Agnes's grip on her wrist torn away as the older woman was thrown bodily against the corridor wall with a sickening impact that left her crumpled and motionless on the stone floor. "Agnes!" Wren's scream tore from her throat before conscious thought could stop it, and she dropped to her knees beside the older woman, her hands shaking as she searched for any sign of breath, of movement, of life. "She's alive," the figure said, his voice carrying the same flat, professional coldness Wren remembered from the two men who had chased her through the cellars days earlier. "For now, whether she stays that way rather depends on how cooperative you're willing to be, girl." Wren looked up into the face of a vampire she did not recognize. Tall and pale, with the particular predatory stillness she had come to associate with the older, more powerful members of the immortal aristocracy, and understood, with a sick lurch of comprehension, that Ravensworth's forces had not simply come to attack Ravengate's defenses generally. They had come specifically for her. Kestrel was very clear about what would satisfy his grievance. The vampire continued, circling slowly, cutting off any possibility of retreat. The housemaid responsible for destroying an 8-year alliance delivered to him personally, alive enough to answer for the humiliation she caused. What happens to you afterward is, I understand, entirely at his discretion. Wren rose slowly to her feet, positioning herself deliberately between the advancing vampire and Agnes's motionless form. Every instinct from the 16 years since the fire that had taken her family screaming at her to run, and finding, beneath that fear, something else entirely a stubborn, unshakable refusal to abandon the closest thing to family she had found since that night, no matter what it cost her. "You'll have to go through me," she said, and was faintly, distantly surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. The vampire's expression flickered with something like amusement. That was rather the intention. Yes, he lunged. And Wren, with no weapon and no supernatural strength to meet him with, did the only thing she could think to do. She threw herself sideways, not away from him, but toward the narrow servants' stairwell she knew ran along the corridor's eastern wall. The same stairwell that connected 3 floors below to the cellars and the old chapel beyond them. She heard him behind her almost immediately, felt the displaced air of his passage close enough to raise the hair on the back of her neck, and understood with dawning, terrible certainty that unlike the 2 hired hands who had chased her days before, this vampire was not going to be outrun. He caught her at the base of the stairwell, one hand closing around her upper arm with bruising, inescapable force, spinning her around to face him with an ease that made her stomach drop. "Clever," he said, almost admiring, but not quite clever enough. He never finished whatever he intended to say next. The stairwell's darkness exploded into sudden, violent motion, a blur of movement too fast for Wren's eyes to fully track, and the grip on her arm vanished as the vampire who held her was torn away and thrown bodily against the stone wall with enough force to crack the ancient masonry. Wren stumbled back, catching herself against the stairwell's rough stone, and looked up to find Cassia standing over the crumpled form of her attacker, his eyes black and ancient and burning with a fury that made the very air around him feel charged with barely contained violence. "You came into my house," Cassius said, his voice a low, resonant growl that Ren felt in her chest as much as heard, "under a false pretense of grievance, and you laid your hands on someone under my protection." He knelt, gripping the stunned vampire by the collar, hauling him upright with terrifying ease. "I want Ravensworth to hear exactly what I am about to do to you, so that he understands precisely what awaits every soldier he sends into my house." What followed was fast and brutal and entirely beyond Ren's ability to fully process in the moment, a blur of violence that ended, within seconds, with the vampire who had attacked her lying motionless and unmoving on the stairwell floor, and Cassius turning immediately, urgently, toward her, all trace of the terrible fury in his expression giving way instantly to raw, desperate concern. "Ren, are you hurt?" "I'm all right." Her voice shook despite her best efforts to steady it. "Agnes," he threw her against the wall. "She isn't moving." Cassius was already moving before she finished speaking, gathering Agnes's still form with a gentleness that belied the violence he had just delivered moments before, his fingers finding a pulse at her throat with visible relief. "She's alive, unconscious, but breathing steadily. We need to get her to the physician immediately, and we need to get you somewhere secure. The fighting has not stopped, Ren. Ravensworth's forces are still moving through the lower levels." He led them both through a series of narrow, hidden passages Ren had never known existed within the manor's ancient walls. Passages that Cassius navigated with the easy familiarity of a man who had spent 2 centuries learning every secret his ancestral home contained. Until they reached a small, fortified chamber deep beneath the West Tower that Ren realized, with dawning understanding, adjoined the old consecrated chapel Agnes had once marked on her hand-drawn map. "This room has protected the Thorn family through 3 separate wars," Cassius said, settling Agnes carefully onto a narrow cot along the chamber's far wall, where a startled young physician, summoned by some silent alarm Ren had not noticed being raised, immediately began examining her. "You will be safe here, while I deal with what remains of Ravensworth's incursion." "Cassius, wait!" Ren caught his arm before he could turn away, fear for him overriding every instinct towards self-preservation that had carried her this far. "How many of them are there? How badly are you outnumbered?" Something in his expression softened, just slightly, beneath the grim determination that had settled over him since the moment he found her in that stairwell. Ravensworth sent a significant force, but not his full strength. He did not expect Ravengate's defenses to hold as well as they have, and he certainly did not expect the sovereign of the Northern Court to personally engage his forces rather than remain sheltered behind his household guard. He reached up, brushing a trembling strand of hair back from her face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the violence still simmering beneath his composed exterior. "I have fought wars before, Ren. I have survived considerably worse odds than this. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to remain here, safe, until this is finished. Be careful," she whispered, and the words carried a weight neither of them had spoken aloud before, an admission of exactly how much she now stood to lose. "Always," Cassius said, and then he was gone, moving back through the hidden passage, with a speed and purpose that left Ren alone with the young physician and Agnes's still, unconscious form, and nothing to do but wait, helpless and terrified. for news of whether the man she had come, over these strange few weeks, to love with her whole, exhausted heart, would survive the night. The battle for Ravengate Manor raged through the remaining hours of darkness, and though Wren could hear only distant fragments of it from the fortified chamber beneath the west tower, the muffled crash of breaking stone, the occasional distant shout carried faintly through the ancient walls. The waiting proved nearly as agonizing as the violence itself. Agnes stirred twice during those long hours, drifting in and out of consciousness under the young physician's careful attention, murmuring fragments of half-formed sentences that gradually, mercifully gave way to genuine, steadying sleep. It was nearly dawn when the hidden passage door finally opened again, and Wren, who had not slept at all, was on her feet instantly, her heart in her throat, before she registered that the figure stepping through the entrance was Cassius, exhausted and battle-worn, but unmistakably, blessedly alive. "It's over," he said, and the relief in his voice was so profound it seemed to strip away, for just a moment, 200 years of practiced sovereign composure, leaving something younger and more vulnerable beneath it. Ravensworth's forces have withdrawn. He personally negotiated the retreat once he understood the full scope of what Kestrel had actually done. A formal grievance, built on a fabricated pretext, does not survive contact with a full council review, and Ravensworth, whatever his ambitions, is not fool enough to continue an unjust war. Once the truth becomes undeniable. Wren crossed the chamber, and without thought or hesitation, wrapped her arms around him, feeling the tension finally, gradually drain from his shoulders as he returned the embrace with a desperate gentleness that spoke more clearly than any words could have of exactly how close the night's events had come to ending in tragedy. "Kestrel," she said finally, pulling back just far enough to look up at him. "What happens to him now?" Something grim settled over Cassius's expression. "The full council convenes at dusk tomorrow. Malcolm Kestrel will answer for ordering an assassination attempt against a member of my household, for fabricating grievances before an allied house, and for the deaths his manufactured war has already caused among Ravensworth's own soldiers tonight. Northern court law is unambiguous about the penalty for a noble house that instigates violence against another under false pretense." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "It will not be a quick reckoning, Wren, but it will be a just one. I promise you that." The following evening, the full Northern Court Council convened in the great hall of Ravengate Manor, transformed once more, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the glittering, performative elegance of the welcome banquet weeks earlier. This gathering was formal in an older, graver sense, the assembled elders seated in a wide circle beneath the same chandeliers that had once illuminated Isabeau Kestrel's triumphant entrance, now presiding instead over her father's formal accounting for treachery. Wren was not required to attend, but Cassius had asked her to be present, quietly, without ceremony, standing near the hall's edge alongside Agnes, whose recovery had progressed remarkably well under the physician's continued care, though a faint bruise still shadowed her temple as testament to the violence of 2 nights before. Malcolm Kestrel stood alone at the center of the circle of elders, stripped of every trace of the confident diplomatic ease he had worn upon his arrival weeks earlier, his composure entirely abandoned in the face of a council that clearly had no intention of extending him mercy. Isabeau stood a careful distance behind him, her expression unreadable, though Wren thought she detected something that might, in a kinder woman, have resembled genuine grief beneath the careful ice of her composure. "The charge before this council," Balthazar intoned, his ancient voice carrying easily through the silent hall. Is treachery against an allied sovereign house, instigation of unjust conflict under fabricated pretense, and the ordering of assassination against a protected member of a sovereign's household. Lord Malcolm Kestrel, how do you answer these charges? Kestrel's jaw worked silently for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice stripped of every trace of its former confidence. I acted to protect the interests of my house and my daughter's future. I do not deny the charges, but I ask this council to consider the provocation. There is no provocation, Cassius said, rising from his seat at the circle's head with quiet, absolute authority. That justifies ordering the murder of an innocent woman who held no political standing whatsoever in this conflict. You did not act to protect your house, Malcolm. You acted to preserve a fortune and a title you believed you were owed, and when that fortune was threatened, you chose violence against the powerless rather than accept a simple, honest failure of negotiation. The council's deliberation, when it came, was swift and unanimous. House Kestrel was formally stripped of its seat among the allied noble houses of the Northern Court, its southern trade privileges suspended indefinitely, pending a full accounting of the damages caused by the manufactured conflict with House Ravensworth, and Malcolm Kestrel himself was sentenced to a century of formal exile from court affairs. His lands and titles passed, by ancient succession law, to his daughter, a punishment that Wren understood. Watching the color drain entirely from Kestrel's face was in its own way considerably more devastating than a swift execution would have been, condemning him to watch his own house survive, and even, eventually, prosper. Entirely without him, Isabeau stepped forward as the council's ruling was formally recorded, and for the first time since Wren had met her, something in her carefully composed features cracked entirely, revealing genuine, unguarded grief beneath the ice. I did not know, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, addressed as much to Cassius as to the assembled council, the full extent of what my father intended. I confess I wanted the alliance badly enough that I did not ask questions I perhaps should have asked. That failure is mine to answer for, whatever this council decides. She turned, finally, to look at Wren directly, something unreadable passing across her expression. I was cruel to you. I will not pretend otherwise, or offer excuses I do not believe myself. I am sorry for it, for whatever that is worth now. Wren, surprised by the admission, found herself, despite everything, unable to summon the satisfaction she might once have expected to feel. I hope you find better for yourself, Lady Isabeau. Away from all of this, Isabeau's expression flickered with something that might, in another life, have become genuine gratitude. Before she turned and followed her father from the hall, the last visible remnant of House Kestrel's brief, catastrophic bid for the northern throne, and the doors closed behind them with an air of quiet, finality. It was 3 weeks later, in the gentle warmth of an early spring afternoon, that Cassius found Wren in the walled garden behind the east wing, kneeling once more among the herb beds that had, over the preceding months, become as much her sanctuary as the conservatory itself. The frost that had blanketed the garden during their first tentative conversations had long since given way to the first green shoots of the new season, and Wren, brushing soil from her hands as she looked up to greet him, thought that she had never in her life felt as entirely, unguardedly at peace. as she did in this quiet corner of Ravengate Manor. "I have something to tell you," Cassius said, settling onto the familiar low stone wall beside her, "that I have been turning over for some weeks now, and I confess I am uncertain how best to explain it." Wren set down her trowel, something in his tone catching her full attention. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous," he said, though a shadow of old careful grief passed briefly across his features, "but important and long overdue." He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "When my father's counsel conducted their investigation into Kestrel's history in the aftermath of the trial, they uncovered records dating back nearly 2 decades, records concerning a rogue coven operating without court sanction in the border territories, responsible for a series of unsanctioned raids against human settlements." He looked at her directly, something careful and searching in his gaze. "One of those raids, Wren, took place in a small village, 3 valleys from where you were later found by your aunt's household. 16 years ago." Wren went very still. "My village. I did not know for certain. Not until Agnes mentioned the details of your history several weeks ago, and I began to piece together dates and locations I had not previously connected." Cassius reached out, taking her hand carefully in both of his. "The coven responsible for that raid was operating in direct violation of court law, hunting a debt they claimed the village elders owed them, exactly as the account you once gave Agnes described. My father's counsel, at the time, dispatched a small contingent to investigate reports of the violence, arriving too late to prevent the raid itself, but in time, according to the surviving records, to intervene before the coven could complete a final sweep of the surrounding forest for any remaining survivors." Wren's breath had gone shallow. 16 years of half-remembered fragments suddenly, painfully rearranging themselves around this new, impossible information. "You're saying someone from this house found me?" "I believe so." Cassius's voice had gone quiet, careful. "The records are incomplete, deliberately so, I suspect, given how thoroughly this house has always guarded the details of its interventions in human affairs. But there is a brief notation, in my father's own hand, describing a single child recovered unharmed from the forest that night, left in the care of the nearest human settlement, with no memory of the rescue itself, a mercy my father apparently insisted upon, believing a child spared the memory of that violence stood a better chance of building an ordinary life afterward." He looked at her, something raw and wondering in his expression. "I do not believe it was coincidence, Wren, that brought you to this house 16 years later. I believe some old, careful hand, whether my father's design or simple fate, has been quietly guiding this story toward this exact garden for a very long time." Wren sat with the revelation for a long, silent moment, feeling 16 years of unanswered fear and half-formed nightmare finally gently settle into something she could, at last, begin to understand rather than simply survive. "Your father saved my life." "My father," Cassius said softly, "saved a great many lives he never spoke of, in ways this court rarely acknowledges. I do not know if he ever imagined that the child he spared that night would return to this house so many years later and, in her own quiet way, save his son's life in turn." He lifted her hand, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, an echo of formal, courtly gesture made entirely, achingly sincere. "I do not believe in coincidence, Wren Ashby. I believe you were always meant to find your way back to this house, long before either of us understood why." Wren felt tears gather. unbidden at the corners of her eyes. 16 years of carefully guarded grief, finally, gently loosening its grip. "I don't know what to do with all of this." "You do not need to know yet," Cassius said gently. "You have time now, Ren. All the time either of us could want." He hesitated, and for the first time since she had known him, Ren saw something that looked almost like nervousness pass across his ancient, composed features. "Which brings me to the second matter I wish to raise with you today." He rose from the stone wall and, with a formality that seemed almost comically out of place in the modest, sun-warmed garden, knelt in the soft earth before her, heedless of the dirt that immediately began staining the fine fabric of his trousers. "I have spent 211 years being told what this crown requires of me," he said. "What alliances I must forge, what bloodlines I must honor, what sacrifices of my own happiness I must accept in service of a court that has, for most of my reign, felt less like a family and more like an obligation I inherited alongside my father's title. I do not wish to spend the next 1,000 years the same way." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, simple ring, unadorned by the elaborate jewels Ren imagined a sovereign's proposal ought to carry. And something in its plain, deliberate simplicity struck her as more meaningful than any fortune in diamonds could have been. "I love you, Ren Ashby. Not because a council demanded it, not because our bloodlines aligned favorably, but because in a house full of people who spent centuries learning to hide everything true about themselves, you were the first person who ever let me be simply, entirely known. I am asking you, without any obligation attached, without any political calculation behind it, to stay beside me, not as my servant, and not as some strategic asset this court might one day value, but as my equal and my wife for however long this strange, extraordinary life allows us." Ren looked down at him, at the ancient king who had upended 200 years of careful court tradition, defied his own counsel, dismantled an alliance 8 years in the making, and gone to war against a rival house, all in defense of a servant girl with no bloodline and no fortune to offer him in return, and understood, with a clarity that felt like the first true breath she had drawn since the fire that took her family 16 years ago, exactly what her answer would be. "Yes," she said, and the word carried the whole weight of everything she had survived to reach this exact, impossible moment. "Yes, Cassius, I'll stay." The wedding that followed, held not in the great hall with its glittering chandeliers and performative court elegance, but in the small, unassuming walled garden where they had first admitted the truth of what had grown between them, was attended by a guest list considerably smaller and considerably stranger than any Ravengate Manor had hosted in centuries. The household staff who had known Ren since her first uncertain days in the conservatory, the surviving council elders who had come, however reluctantly, to respect the sovereign's unconventional choice, and Lady Miriam Thorne, who wept, quietly and without apology, at the sight of her son finally, fully happy for the first time since his father's death nearly a century before. Agnes stood at Ren's side throughout the ceremony, serving in the role Ren had once imagined. In her loneliest moments, no one in this world would ever fill for her not a servant's duty, but a mother's quiet, fierce pride. The Northern Court, in the months that followed, adjusted slowly and not always gracefully to the reality of a sovereign whose queen had once scrubbed the manor's floors and tended its gardens with her own 2 hands. There were whispers, inevitably, in the drawing rooms of the remaining noble houses. Careful questions about bloodlines and precedent that Wren, with the same quiet resolve that had once carried her 3 miles through burning forest as a child, learned to answer with grace rather than apology. She did not need the court's approval to know, with absolute certainty, that she belonged exactly where she had chosen to stand. And in the walled garden behind the east wing of Ravengate Manor, where frost gave way each year to new green growth exactly as it had on the night, a servant girl and a king first admitted, in the cold hush of a November evening, that duty and desire did not always have to stand opposed to one another. Wren Ashby, once a nameless orphan with no family and no future, tended her herbs each spring beside the immortal husband, who had chosen her, against every law and expectation of his ancient world, simply because she was the only person in 2 centuries who had ever made him feel entirely, unguardedly human. The council had demanded a queen worthy of the Thorne bloodline. Cassius gave them something they had never once considered, a queen worthy of his heart instead. And in the end, the Northern Court found that the alliance no fortune could have purchased was worth infinitely more than the one they had lost. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for Wren from that very first candlelit moment in the library, let us know in the comments below. Hit that like button, share this video with every dark romance lover you know, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale of forbidden love, ancient power, and the quiet, unbreakable strength of a heart that refuses to be overlooked. In the years that followed, long after the scandal of the broken Kestrel alliance had faded into little more than a cautionary tale whispered occasionally among the court's more traditional elders, visitors to Ravengate Manor would often remark on a peculiar detail that seemed, on the surface, entirely at odds with the grandeur of a sovereign's ancestral seat. Tucked behind the east wing, visible from the manor's upper windows, a modest walled garden bloomed each spring with an abundance of herbs and wildflowers that had no place in the formal, curated landscaping surrounding the rest of the estate, a small, deliberately unpolished sanctuary that the Queen of the Northern Court tended personally with her own 2 hands every single year without fail. Few outside the household ever learned the full story of how that garden came to matter so much to the woman who ruled beside Cassius Thorne, or why the Queen insisted, against every expectation of her station, on keeping her hands calloused and her knowledge of rootstock and remedy as sharp as it had been in her earliest days as a servant girl, with nothing but her mother's half-remembered lessons and a quiet, stubborn will to survive. But those who did know, the household staff, who had watched her grow from a frightened newcomer into the unshakable heart of an entire court, understood that the garden was never simply decoration. It was a reminder, deliberately preserved, of exactly how far an ordinary girl with no bloodline and no fortune had traveled to find a home worth every impossible cost of claiming it.